I'll be honest, life's been predictable for me. I work hard, come home tired, and keep my head down. That's how my parents raised me. Loyalty and hard work are everything. So when Jillian, my wife, started buzzing about her high school reunion, I didn't think much of it. She was excited, her eyes lighting up whenever she mentioned her old friends. I was just focused on making sure we didn't fall behind on bills. The day of the reunion, I came home from work completely wiped. Jillian was upstairs getting ready, music blasting. "You good up there?" I called out, hoping for a moment to sit and catch my breath. Yeah, just figuring out what to wear," she shouted back, like my exhaustion wasn't even on her radar. When she finally came downstairs, I was stunned. She looked different. It wasn't just the dress, though it clung to her like it was designed to make every man stare. It was the way she carried herself, like someone with something to prove. "You like it?" she asked, spinning around, her smile just a little too wide. "Yeah, you look great," I replied, but my stomach twisted. It wasn't jealousy, just this nagging feeling that something was off. She brushed past me, grabbed her purse, and didn't even notice how quiet I'd gotten. We drove in silence. Jillian tapped away on her phone, laughing at messages from her old classmates. I tried to join in, asking who she was talking to, but her answers were vague, dismissive. At the reunion, things started okay. Jillian introduced me to a few people, though I could tell she was distracted, scanning the room. When she finally spotted her group of friends, she lit up and practically dragged me over. I didn't mind at first. She was happy, and that's what mattered, right? But as the night went on, I felt more like a shadow than her husband. Jillian drifted from one conversation to the next, laughing loudly, her arm brushing against old classmates. She barely glanced at me. I stuck by the punch bowl, exchanging awkward nods with strangers. When I tried to pull her aside for a dance, she waved me off. "Not now, Greg. I'm catching up," she said, her tone sharp, like I'd interrupted something important. By the time the group started reminiscing about their senior prom, I was ready to leave. But then I noticed her talking to Troy. He was tall, with this easy confidence that made me instantly uncomfortable. They laughed like no time had passed, leaning in close. My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to make a scene. That's when things started spiraling. Jillian and Troy's laughter turned into whispers, then more frequent glances my way. By the time the reunion ended, Jillian was insisting we join the after-party at a nearby club. "Do we really need to?" I asked, my voice laced with exhaustion. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Greg. It'll be fun. Don't be such a killjoy." We pulled up to the club, and I was already second-guessing myself. The music thumped so loud, I could feel it in my chest before we even got out of the car. Jillian, on the other hand, was practically glowing, chatting nonstop with Troy as we walked in. I followed behind, feeling more like a third wheel than her husband. Inside, the place was packed. Neon lights bounced off walls slick with condensation, and the crowd was a blur of laughing faces and clinking glasses. Jillian and Troy slipped ahead, weaving through the throng like they knew the layout by heart. I lingered near the entrance, unsure of where I even fit in. "Come on, Greg. Lighten up." Jillian shouted over the music, flashing me a grin before disappearing into the mass of bodies with Troy. I found myself standing there, rooted in place. Part of me wanted to follow them, but another part, a quieter, angrier voice, kept telling me to let it play out. So I made my way to the bar, ordered a beer, and tried to act like I wasn't fuming inside. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. I scanned the dance floor, hoping to catch sight of Jillian. I finally spotted her in the middle of the crowd. Troy was there, too. They were dancing, but it wasn't the kind of casual dancing you do with a friend. No, this was close. Too close. His hands hovered at her waist, fingers grazing the fabric of her dress. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned in, laughing at something he said, her hand resting on his chest like it belonged there. My grip tightened around my beer bottle until I thought it might shatter. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe this was just how old friends danced. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just friendly. This was intimate. I couldn't sit there anymore. Slamming my bottle on the bar, I pushed through the crowd, my heart pounding harder than the bass in the speakers. When I reached them, I didn't even try to hide my anger. "Jillian," I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the music. She turned, startled, her face going pale for a split second before she masked it with a nervous smile. "Greg, you made it to the dance floor," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm not blind," I replied, my tone hard enough to wipe the fake smile off her face. Troy stepped back, raising his hands like he was the innocent one. "Relax, man. We're just dancing," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with fake charm. "I'm not talking to you," I snapped, my eyes never leaving Jillian. She looked away, like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out after curfew. "You're overreacting," she muttered, barely meeting my gaze. "Am I?" I shot back, because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look like just dancing. The crowd around us started to notice the tension, their laughter and chatter fading as people turned to watch. Jillian tugged on my arm, trying to pull me away. "Let's not do this here," she whispered harshly, her eyes darting around. "Why not?" "Embarrassed," I hissed. "Maybe you should have thought about that before disappearing with him." Troy stepped in then, his easy-going facade cracking just enough to show a hint of annoyance. "Look, Greg, if this is going to be a thing, maybe you should head home and cool off." I laughed, bitter and sharp. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere, but you can." He didn't move, his jaw tightening. Before either of us could say anything else, Jillian stepped between us, her hands out like a referee breaking up a fight. "That's enough. Both of you," she snapped, her voice louder than I'd ever heard it. She turned to me, her face twisting with irritation. "Greg, you're making a scene. Let's just go home." The ride back was silent, the kind of silence that felt like a storm brewing. Jillian sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window while I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Every word I wanted to say burned in my throat, but I couldn't let out. Not yet. When we pulled into the driveway, Jillian finally broke the silence. "You embarrassed me back there," she said, her voice low and cold. "I embarrassed you," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You're the one acting like a teenager at prom with her old boyfriend." She rolled her eyes, unbuckling her seatbelt. "You're being ridiculous, Greg. It was nothing, but it wasn't nothing, and deep down I knew it." The tension was suffocating as we walked into the house. Jillian kicked off her heels and headed straight for the living room, grabbing her phone off the counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. I followed, my chest tightening with every step. "Jillian," I started, my voice strained but steady. "We need to talk. Now." She sighed dramatically, sinking into the couch. "About what, Greg?" "The fact that you ruined a perfectly good night by overreacting." "Don't," I snapped, sharper than I intended. "Don't twist this around like I'm the problem. I saw the way you were with Troy. You think I'm just going to ignore that?" Her fingers hovered over her phone, and for a second, she didn't look at me. "You're reading too much into it," she said finally, her tone flat. "Am I?" I said, stepping closer. "Then look me in the eye and tell me there's nothing going on. Tell me you haven't been talking to him outside tonight." That got her attention. Her head snapped up, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Guilt, hesitation, maybe both. Then, just like that, her face hardened. "You're being paranoid," she said, standing up, her voice rising. "He's an old friend, Greg. That's it." I shook my head, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't believe you. I've known you long enough to tell when you're lying, Jillian." That struck a nerve. Her jaw tightened, and she crossed her arms, her voice icy. "You're really going to stand there and accuse me of lying? After everything we've been through?" "Yes," I said firmly, meeting her glare head-on. "Because I know what I saw tonight wasn't innocent." She let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room. "God, you're impossible. Do you even hear yourself? You're turning this into something it's not. Then prove me wrong. I shot back. Show me your phone. Let's see how innocent this really is. The color drained from her face. She clutched the phone tighter, her body stiffening like a cornered animal. That was all the confirmation I needed. Greg, she started, her voice softer now, almost pleading. You don't want to do this. No, Jillian, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You don't want me to do this. But I'm done playing dumb. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a long breath. Fine, she said, tossing her phone onto the couch like it burned her hand. You want to see it? Go ahead. I grabbed the phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. The first thing I saw was a text thread with Troy, his name saved with a stupid little heart emoji. My chest tightened as I scrolled up, each message like a knife to the gut. There were inside jokes, flirty compliments, and worst of all, plans to meet up. Plans that didn't include me. So, this is just catching up? I asked, my voice low, holding the phone up. This is what friends do. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, staring at the floor like it held the answer to some question she couldn't face. Answer me, Jillian, I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my anger and hurt. Yes, okay, she snapped, spinning around to face me. Her eyes were wild, her voice trembling with frustration. Yes, we've been talking. Yes, I've been meeting him. But it's not what you think. What I think, I repeated, my laughter bitter and hollow. What I think is that my wife has been sneaking around with her high school boyfriend while I've been breaking my back to provide for us. It's not like that, she insisted, her voice breaking. We've just been reconnecting. That's all. Reconnecting, I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. Are you serious? Do you hear yourself right now? She stepped closer, her hands out like she was trying to calm me down. Greg, listen. No, Jillian. You listen, I interrupted, shaking my head. You've been lying to me. You've been lying to my face and treating me like I'm the crazy one. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually show some remorse. But when she looked up, her expression was defiant, her voice cold. I'm not happy, Greg, she said, the words hitting me like a punch to the chest. I haven't been happy for a long time. I stared at her, stunned into silence. I didn't plan for this to happen, she continued, her voice quieter now, but no less sharp. But Troy understands me in a way you never have. He makes me feel alive again. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak. So what are you saying, Jillian? That you're throwing away our marriage for him? She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was calm. Too calm. I think we need to end this, she said, her words cutting through me like glass. I want a divorce. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. You want a divorce? I asked, barely above a whisper. Jillian nodded, crossing her arms like she was protecting herself. I don't see another way, Greg. I need to be honest with you, and with myself. Honest. I scoffed, bitterness creeping into my voice. That's rich, coming from someone who's been sneaking around with Troy. She flinched, but didn't deny it. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she muttered, avoiding my eyes. What was it supposed to be, Jillian? A fun little fling, while I stayed clueless. She hesitated, then looked at me with a strange mix of guilt and defiance. I didn't mean to hurt you, Greg, but I can't stay in a marriage where I feel trapped. I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone cold, distant. You've already made your choice, I said finally, my voice hollow. She didn't deny it, and that hurt more than anything. I stood there, feeling like the ground had given way beneath me. Jillian, the woman I had built my life with, didn't even seem sorry. You've been lying to me, humiliating me, and now you want to walk away like it's nothing, I said, my voice low, trembling with anger. It's not nothing, Greg, she snapped, her eyes flashing. But I deserve to be happy too. You can't keep me here out of guilt. Guilt, I said, laughing bitterly. I've sacrificed everything for us, for you. And this is how you repay me. She looked away, arms folded, like she couldn't even face me. We've been drifting apart for years. This just made me realize it. No, Jillian, I said, stepping closer. This isn't about us drifting apart. It's about you making selfish choices. About you thinking the grass is greener with him. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she sighed and picked up her bag. I'll stay at my sister's tonight, she said flatly, like she was announcing the weather. We'll talk more when things cool down. I didn't stop her. I just watched as she walked out the door without so much as a glance back. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the house was deafening. For the first time, I felt truly alone. The house felt colder without her. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, replaying her words in my head. We've been drifting apart. I deserve to be happy. It didn't sound like the woman I married. It sounded rehearsed, like something she'd convinced herself to believe. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with Troy. Her laugh, her hand on his chest, the way she looked at him like I didn't exist. By morning, I was running on fumes. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank wall across from me. My phone buzzed, messages from friends who'd been at the reunion. Hey, Greg, are you okay? Last night seemed tense. Tense. I thought bitterly. That was putting it mildly. I didn't reply. Instead, I scrolled through my phone, feeling a surge of anger I couldn't control. I found Troy's number in Jillian's text history and dialed. He picked up on the second ring, sounding annoyingly casual. Hello. It's Greg, I said, my voice hard. We need to talk. There was a pause. Now's not really a good time. Make time, I snapped. Unless you'd rather I show up at your door. Another pause, then a sigh. Fine. Coffee shop on Main in an hour. Fine, I said, hanging up. I didn't know what I was going to say to him, but one thing was clear. I wasn't letting this go. By the time I got to the coffee shop, my nerves were on fire. I hadn't even decided what I was going to say, but my anger had a momentum of its own, pulling me forward. Troy was already there, sitting at a table by the window, scrolling on his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. I walked in, and his eyes flicked up, a smirk playing on his lips. That smirk made my blood boil. Greg, he said, leaning back in his chair like this was some casual meetup. Didn't think you'd actually call. I sat down across from him, the tension between us thick enough to cut. Let's get one thing straight, I said, keeping my voice low. I'm not here to chat. I want to know what the hell you think you're doing with my wife. He raised his hands in mock innocence. Hey man, I didn't come looking for trouble. Jillian and I just reconnected. That's all. Reconnected. I repeated, my fists clenching under the table. Is that what you call sneaking around and dancing with another man's wife? He shrugged, his smirk unwavering. Look, Greg, I didn't force her into anything. She reached out to me, okay? If you want someone to blame, maybe start with yourself. Maybe if you'd treated her better. That was it. My hand slammed down on the table, rattling the coffee cups nearby. A few heads turned, but I didn't care. Don't you dare, I hissed, leaning closer. Don't you dare act like you're the good guy here. You're nothing but a homewrecker, and you knew exactly what you were doing. Troy's smirk faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. Look, I get that you're upset, he said, his tone shifting to something resembling false sincerity. But Jillian made her choice. Maybe it's time you accept that. I stared at him, my chest heaving. Except, how could I? My entire world was falling apart, and he was sitting here like he'd won some twisted game. Let me make one thing clear, I said, my voice cold. You don't know a damn thing about my marriage, so don't act like you're her savior. You're just a convenient distraction for someone too cowardly to face her own problems. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually snap back. But instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping. And what are you, Greg? Some perfect husband who didn't see this coming. I didn't have an answer. Not because he was right, but because the anger I felt was tangled up with guilt. Could I have done more? Was I too caught up in work to notice Jillian slipping away? Troy took my silence as a victory. He leaned back, picking up his coffee like this was just another day. "Look, man," he said almost casually. "I'm not here to fight you. But Jillian's not happy with you anymore. And if she thinks she'd be happier with me, that's her choice." The arrogance in his tone made my stomach churn. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't over," I said, glaring down at him. "Stay away from her, Troy. Because if you don't, you'll wish you had." He didn't respond, just watched as I walked out, his smirk creeping back like he thought he'd already won. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to cool my anger. My hands shook as I got into my car, my head spinning with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. Jillian wasn't just slipping away. She was being pulled away, piece by piece, by someone who had no right to her. And as much as I hated him, part of me hated her more for letting it happen. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet that I sat in my car for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Troy's words played on a loop in my head. Jillian made her choice. I drove home, every mile feeling heavier than the last. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always did. Quiet, still, like nothing had changed. But everything had. Inside, the silence was deafening. Jillian hadn't come back, and part of me didn't want her to. The thought of her walking through the door, acting like nothing had happened, made me feel sick. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. As I stood there, staring at the sink, memories of us flooded back. The times we'd laughed, argued, made up. For so long, this house had been our home. Now it felt like strangers. My phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it, half hoping it was Jillian, maybe with some kind of explanation or apology. But it wasn't her. It was my best friend, Mike. "Hey man, you okay?" his text read. I didn't answer right away. Mike was one of the few people who knew me well enough to tell when something was wrong. After a moment, I replied, "Not really. Can you come over?" 20 minutes later, Mike was at my door, a 6-pack of beer in hand. He took one look at me and shook his head. "You look like hell." "Feel worse," I muttered, stepping aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, the silence stretching between us as I cracked open a beer. Finally, Mike spoke. "So, you gonna tell me what's going on?" I hesitated, not sure where to start. But once the words came, they didn't stop. I told him everything. The reunion, the dancing, the texts, Jillian's cold admission, and my confrontation with Troy. Mike listened quietly, his face growing darker with every word. When I finished, he leaned back, shaking his head. "Man, that's brutal." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, no kidding. So, what are you gonna do?" he asked, watching me closely. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hollow. "She says she wants a divorce. Like it's just that simple." Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Greg, you don't have to make any decisions tonight. But one thing's clear. You deserve better than this." "Do I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because right now, it feels like I've failed. Like this is my fault." He shook his head firmly. "No, don't go there. Whatever problems you guys had, cheating isn't the answer. That's on her, not you." His words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of clarity. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't all my fault. But that didn't make it hurt any less. After Mike left, the silence crept back in, heavy and suffocating. I thought about calling Jillian, but what would I even say? She had been clear. She wanted out. No apologies, no attempts to fix things. Just an icy, matter-of-fact decision to leave me behind. I ended up in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed we used to share. Her side was neatly made, the same way she always left it, but her scent lingered faintly on the pillow. I reached out to touch it, then stopped myself, pulling my hand back like it would burn me. That night was the first time in years I slept without her. Well, tried to sleep. The minutes dragged into hours, the bed feeling impossibly big and cold. Every creak of the house made me wonder if she was coming back, if I'd hear her keys in the door, her heels clicking on the tile. But she didn't come back. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark, and the first thing I felt was an ache in my chest, like my heart had forgotten how to beat properly. The clock read 4:13 a.m., too early to do anything, but too late to hope for sleep. I got up, wandering through the house aimlessly, the memories hitting me like waves. The couch where we'd binge-watch TV shows. The kitchen where we'd argue about what to order for dinner. The doorway where we'd kiss goodbye before work. It was all still here. And yet, it wasn't. I ended up in the garage, staring at my toolbox. My dad always said that when life felt out of control, keeping your hands busy helped. So, I grabbed some sandpaper and the old wooden bench I'd been meaning to refinish for months. For the next few hours, I worked in silence, the repetitive motion dulling the edge of my thoughts. By the time the sun came up, the bench looked the same, but my hands were raw, and my head felt just a little bit clearer. I walked back inside and made coffee, the routine grounding me in a way nothing else had. Sitting at the kitchen table, I opened my phone and stared at Jillian's contact name. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I couldn't do it. What would I even say? That I missed her. That I wanted to fix this. She made her choice. And maybe it was time I started thinking about mine. The day stretched endlessly ahead of me. Jillian still hadn't called or texted, and I didn't know if that was a relief or another knife in my chest. I'd been trying to stay busy cleaning, fixing things around the house, but no matter how much I distracted myself, the truth always crept back in. By mid-afternoon, I had enough of sitting with my thoughts. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, not sure where I was going but needing to move. I ended up at the park near our house. Jillian and I used to come here on weekends, walking hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. Now, it felt like a ghost town, every bench and path a reminder of what I'd lost. I sat on a bench overlooking the pond, watching a couple with their toddler feed the ducks. They looked so normal, so unbroken. That's when my phone buzzed. For a second, my heart leapt, thinking maybe it was Jillian. But when I pulled it out, it wasn't her. It was Mike again, checking in, his text read. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. After a moment, I typed, "Still here." Barely. His reply came fast. "Let's grab a drink tonight. You shouldn't be alone." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to crawl back into bed and shut out the world. But another part, the part that was tired of feeling like a victim, wanted to say yes. "Okay," I typed back. By the time I met Mike at the bar, the place was packed with people laughing, drinking, and living lives that didn't feel like they could ever intersect with mine. Mike waved me over to a booth in the corner, a beer already waiting for me. "Thought you might need this," he said, sliding it across the table. "Thanks," I muttered, taking a long sip. Mike didn't press me to talk, and I was grateful for that. We sat in silence for a while, watching the chaos around us. But eventually, he broke the quiet. "So, have you heard from her?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, and I'm not sure I want to." Mike frowned, leaning back in his seat. "She's at her sister's, right?" "That's what she said," I replied, though even as the words left my mouth, doubt crept in. He raised an eyebrow. "You don't believe her?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," I admitted. "Everything she's said or done lately has been a lie." Mike nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about hiring someone? Like a PI?" I stared at him, surprised. "A private investigator? For what?" "To get answers," he said simply. "If she's not being honest with you, maybe it's time you found out the truth on your own terms." I hadn't considered that. The idea felt extreme, like something out of a bad movie. But as I sat there, turning it over in my mind, I couldn't shake the thought. "Maybe," I said finally. "Just think about it," Mike said. "You deserve to know the full story, Greg. Whatever it is." I nodded, though the pit in my stomach told me the full story might be more than I could handle. When I got home, the house was as empty as I'd left it. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, Mike's words echoing in my head. After a long moment, I opened a browser and typed, "Private investigator near me." It was time to get answers. The next morning, I woke up with the investigator's number still open on my phone. I hadn't worked up the courage to call the night before, but now, in the harsh light of day, the idea felt unavoidable. I needed answers. My hands trembled as I tapped the number. It rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Kingston Investigations, how can I help you?" I cleared my throat, forcing myself to speak. "Hi, my name's Greg. I need to look into someone." "My wife." "Understood," the voice said, completely unfazed. "Why don't we start with the basics? Are you available to meet in person?" "Yeah," I said quickly. "When?" "Today works. We're open until 5. "I'll come by." After hanging up, I felt a mix of relief and dread. This was a step forward, but it also meant I was admitting, out loud, to a stranger, that my wife might be betraying me. Again, the office was tucked into a nondescript strip mall, the kind of place you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Inside, the walls were lined with old case photos, grainy black and white images that made the whole thing feel surreal. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Kingston, shook my hand and motioned for me to sit. "Tell me what's going on," he said, his tone neutral but attentive. I laid it all out: Jillian's behavior at the reunion, her emotional distance, the texts with Troy, and her sudden decision to leave. Kingston didn't react, just scribbled notes as I spoke. When I finished, he looked up. "It sounds like you're looking for confirmation, whether there's more to this than she's letting on." "Exactly," I said. He nodded. "It's common in cases like this. If she's hiding something, we'll find it. I'll need a few details: her schedule, the places she frequents, any habits or routines she might stick to." I gave him everything I could think of, from her favorite coffee shop to her sister's address. When I mentioned Troy, his pen paused. "You said they were close at the reunion." "More than close," I muttered, bitterness creeping into my voice. Kingston nodded. "We'll start there. If she's still in contact with him, it won't take long to confirm." As I left the office, my stomach churned. I had done what I set out to do, but the idea of someone following Jillian, documenting her every move, made the whole thing feel final. I wasn't just suspecting anymore. I was actively searching for proof. The next few days passed in a haze. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, half hoping and half dreading that it was Kingston. Meanwhile, Jillian remained silent. She hadn't come back, hadn't called, and I was too proud or too hurt to reach out myself. Mike checked in daily, his voice always steady and reassuring. "How are you holding up?" he'd ask, and I'd give him the same answer: "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. Every hour that passed without knowing felt like another weight added to my chest. At work, I barely got anything done, my mind constantly wandering to what Kingston might uncover. By the 4th day, the waiting was unbearable. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when my phone finally rang. It was Kingston. "We've got something," he said, his voice steady. "Can you come in tomorrow?" My throat tightened, but I forced myself to reply. "Yeah, what is it?" "It's better if we go over it in person," he said. "See you at 10. "Okay," I said, hanging up. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it Troy? Was it someone else? Or had Jillian been telling the truth all along? By the time morning came, I felt like I was running on pure adrenaline. The office felt colder this time, the hum of the overhead lights grating against my nerves. Kingston motioned for me to sit, his face unreadable. He placed a folder on the desk between us, sliding it toward me. We followed her for 3 days. "You're going to want to see this." I opened the folder with shaking hands, the photos inside blurring for a moment before coming into focus. Jillian wasn't at her sister's. She was at a hotel with Troy. The images were clear: her getting into his car, walking into the hotel, and leaving hours later. Each photo was a dagger, twisting deeper into my chest. Kingston's voice broke through the fog. "We also tracked her phone activity. The texts between her and Troy were explicit. It's clear this has been going on for a while. I stared at the photos, the weight of the betrayal crashing down all over again. This wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just flirtation. It was real, physical, undeniable. Do you want us to keep digging? Kingston asked, his voice careful. I closed the folder, my jaw tight. No, I said quietly. I've seen enough. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the folder on the coffee table in front of me like a bomb waiting to go off. My chest felt hollow, the edges of my anger sharpening into something colder, more focused. Jillian had made her choice. Now, it was my turn to make mine. I sat there staring at the folder, the evidence of Jillian's betrayal right in front of me. Each photo felt like it was burning a hole in my chest, but more than anything, it fueled a resolve I hadn't felt in days. I wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences. Jillian's lies had humiliated me, crushed me, but now I had the truth. As she thought she could leave me quietly and slip into a new life with Troy, she was dead wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. It rang a few times before she answered, her voice cautious. Greg, we need to talk, I said, keeping my tone cold and steady. She hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Make time, I interrupted, my words cutting through her excuse. Either you come here, or I come find you. Your choice. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her calculating, trying to decide whether she should comply or push back. Fine, she said finally, her voice clipped. I'll come over tomorrow after work. No, I said firmly. Tonight. 7 o'clock. She sighed, clearly annoyed. Fine. 7. When the line went dead, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The clock on the wall read 5:42 p.m. I had just over an hour to get my head straight. I spent the time pacing the house, going over everything I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to throw her betrayal in her face and make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But another part wanted to stay calm, to keep the upper hand. When her car finally pulled into the driveway, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I stood in the living room, the folder on the coffee table, waiting for her to walk in. She stepped through the door, looking polished, composed, like nothing had happened. But when her eyes met mine, she froze. "What's this about, Greg?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. I motioned toward the couch. "Sit." She hesitated, but finally sat down, her posture stiff. I picked up the folder and held it in my hands, letting the weight of it hang in the air before I spoke. "You lied to me, Jillian," I said, my voice calm but hard. "Not just about Troy. About everything." Her eyes flickered to the folder, and I saw the faintest trace of panic. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice wavering. I tossed the folder onto the table, the photos spilling out. "This," I said, watching her reaction closely. She stared at the pictures, her face draining of color. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her hands gripping the edge of the couch, like it might steady her. "How did you get these?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been lying to me while sneaking off to hotels with him." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with something between fear and anger. "You had me followed. Don't try to make this about me," I snapped. "You're the one who cheated, Jillian. You're the one who destroyed our marriage." She flinched at my words, but her expression quickly hardened. "I told you I wasn't happy, Greg. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I needed more than what we had." "Don't give me that," I said, my voice rising. "If you were unhappy, you could have talked to me. You didn't have to lie, sneak around, and humiliate me like this." She stood up, her fists clenched. "And what do you want me to say, Greg? That I'm sorry. That I regret it. Fine. I'm sorry. But you weren't enough for me anymore. That's the truth." Her words hit me like a slap, but I refused to show it. "You're unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "You threw away everything we had for what? Some high school fantasy." "I threw it away because I needed something real," she shot back. "Something you haven't given me in years." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling between us. "I hope he was worth it," I said quietly, the anger in my voice replaced with cold finality. "Because there's no coming back from this, Jillian." She stared at me, her defiance faltering for the first time. But instead of apologizing, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "Maybe there shouldn't be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, she was gone. Again. But this time, I wasn't chasing after her. The door slammed shut, and with it came a silence so thick it pressed down on me. She was gone. This time, it felt final. I sank onto the couch, staring at the scattered photos on the table. Each one felt like a scar, a permanent reminder of how much I'd lost. For a long time, I just sat there, unable to move, unable to think beyond the hollow ache in my chest. Eventually, I grabbed the folder and shoved it into a drawer. Out of sight, but not out of mind. It didn't matter now. I had all the confirmation I'd ever need. The hours dragged by. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. I just existed, cycling through anger, sadness, and something that felt like numbness. It wasn't until my phone buzzed again that I snapped out of it. It was Mike. "You okay? How'd it go?" I stared at the screen for a while before typing back. "She's gone." Again. Said I wasn't enough. His response came quickly. "That's bull. You're more than enough, Greg. She's just too selfish to see it." I wanted to believe him, but the doubts lingered, nagging at the edges of my mind. The next morning, I forced myself to get up and go for a walk. The cold air bit at my skin, but it cleared my head, gave me a moment to breathe. The park was nearly empty, the paths lined with frost. I ended up back at the bench by the pond. It had become my place to think, to process. Watching the water ripple in the breeze, I tried to focus on what came next. Divorce. The word fell heavy, like a door slamming shut on everything I'd built. But wasn't that what Jillian wanted? She'd made her choice clear. When I got home, I called a lawyer. It wasn't an easy call to make, but I knew it was necessary. I wasn't going to let her walk away without facing the consequences. The lawyer, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, listened carefully as I explained the situation. "We'll start by gathering everything we need: financials, property details, evidence of infidelity. This won't be easy, Greg, but we'll make sure you're protected. Evidence." I repeated, thinking of the folder still tucked away in the drawer. "Yes," she said. "Infidelity can impact the settlement, especially if there's proof." I promised to send her everything and hung up, feeling a mix of dread and resolve. That evening, as I sorted through old paperwork and emails, I stumbled across an album Jillian and I had made years ago. It was full of photos from vacations, anniversaries, and lazy Sundays. Her smile in those pictures was so genuine, so full of love. I couldn't reconcile that version of her with the person who had just walked out the door. Part of me still wanted to reach out, to ask her why, to try and fix something that couldn't be fixed. But the other part, the part that knew I deserved better, kept me from picking up the phone. Instead, I packed the album away in a box, along with other reminders of the life we'd shared. It was time to let go. For the first time in days, I slept through the night. When I woke up, the ache was still there, but it felt a little less suffocating. This wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, I felt like I could see a way forward. A life without Jillian, a life where I could start over. She had made her choice. Now I was making mine. Weeks passed. The divorce papers were drafted, and I was slowly piecing my life back together. It wasn't easy, but every day felt a little less heavy. Jillian hadn't tried to contact me, and I hadn't reached out either. Mike checked in regularly, and my lawyer, Evelyn, kept me updated on the legal process. For the first time, I was beginning to accept that maybe this was for the best. One evening, I was at the park again, sitting on my usual bench. The air was crisp, the faint sound of kids playing in the distance. I closed my eyes and let the stillness wash over me. Then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Mike or Evelyn. Instead, it was an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me swipe to answer. Hello? Greg. The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. It was Jillian. I froze, gripping the phone tighter. What do you want? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She hesitated, and for a moment, all I could hear was her breathing. Then she spoke. I made a mistake. I laughed bitterly, the sound surprising even me. A little late for that, don't you think? I know, she said quickly, but you need to know the truth before it's too late. My stomach churned. What truth, Jillian? It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said, her voice cracking. Troy. He's not who you think he is. I felt my chest tighten. What are you talking about? He doesn't care about me, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. It was never about me. It was about you. Me. I repeated, my mind racing. He hates you, Greg, she said. Always has. He wanted to ruin you, to take everything from you. And I let him. Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. You're telling me this now, after you've already destroyed our marriage. I didn't realize what he was doing until it was too late, she said, her voice desperate. I thought he loved me, but all he ever talked about was how much he resented you, how he was going to win. I couldn't breathe. Troy hadn't just stolen my wife. He'd made her part of some twisted game. Why are you telling me this now, Jillian? I asked, my voice trembling with anger. Because he's not done, she said. He's been asking questions about your job, your accounts. I think he's planning something worse. My pulse pounded in my ears. What do you mean, worse? I don't know, she said, her voice barely audible. But you need to be careful. He's not who he pretends to be. The line went dead before I could say another word. I drove home in a daze, her warning echoing in my head. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights illuminated a figure standing by my front door. It was Troy. He didn't look smug this time. He looked calm, almost eerily so, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. What the hell are you doing here? I demanded, stepping out of the car. He smiled faintly, his hands in his pockets. Just wanted to talk, Greg. About what? How you've ruined my life. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. I didn't ruin your life. You did that all on your own. What are you talking about? I asked, my chest tightening. He stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. You think I wanted Jillian? She was just a means to an end. I wanted to watch you fall apart. And it worked. My fists clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. Why? What did I ever do to you? His eyes darkened. You had everything handed to you. Success, respect, Jillian. You didn't deserve any of it. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about Jillian. This was about revenge. You're pathetic, I said, my voice cold. You think breaking me will fix whatever's wrong with your life. It won't. His smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. You don't get it, do you? He said, stepping back. This isn't over, Greg. Not by a long shot. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jillian's warning and Troy's parting words replayed in my mind over and over. This wasn't just a failed marriage anymore. It was something darker, more dangerous. I didn't know what Troy was planning, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let him win. This wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was the one I was left with. And I wasn't going down without a fight.